Young Minds tonight.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you at part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
It's our ongoing effort here to check in with the younger minds in the region, whether they be at the high schools or the colleges. And we got a recommendation from our good friend, Professor Michael Hannity, about a couple of his students. And I'm guessing if this works out, he'll feed me a whole bunch of them because, you know, once Mike Hannity gets going, you never know when it's going to stop. The sociologist du jour of our program. Great to have you in. Thanks for tuning in on this Tuesday evening. There will be a spring, Virginia, sometime. I'm just not sure. I'm going to stop small talking on the weather because this is it's just completely unruly, don't you think? Coming up this week, I just want to FYI, we're going to check in on that hospital situation, all that transactional controversy going on with Miriam Hospital, Memorial Hospital, leaving Miriam kind of alone in the neighborhood, and back and forth. We've got all sorts of fighting going on between the companies, those who have assets, those who want assets, mergers, acquisitions, this and that. I think most of us have no idea, other than what your doctor's name is, how this whole thing works, and so we'll focus on that tomorrow, okay? We're going to skip a lot of the local stuff today and kind of get into what's happening in Washington. There's a headline here that is just, you know, part of the ongoing saga. And now Sean Hannity is in the middle of this mess. Hannity was named as the third legal client by Michael Cohen's defense attorneys. Michael Cohen, of course, the personal attorney for Donald Trump, who was in court yesterday arguing in front of the federal judge that he needs all the information that the U.S. attorney got when they raided his office and home. And I'm not sure how that's going to turn out. He got a little bit of a procedural victory yesterday, but I'm not exactly sure that they're going to be able to claim any kind of attorney-client privilege on most of the stuff that they're looking for. And then it pops up that Sean Hannity of Fox News and talk radio fame is one of his clients. Of course, Hannity, like he's apt to do, milked the living daylights out of it on his program last night. Here's kind of a summary from CBS.
Michael Cohen never represented me in any legal matter.
Fox News host Sean Hannity downplayed his relationship with President Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, hours after being unmasked as one of 3 people he represented in 2017.
I never retained his services. I never received an invoice. I never paid Michael Cohen for legal fees.
The surprise disclosure came during a hearing Monday over materials seized during the FBI raids of Cohen's home, offices, and hotel room last week. Citing attorney-client privilege, Cohen and other lawyers for Mr. Trump argued they should have the right to review the items first. Instead, Judge Kimba Wood ordered prosecutors to create a searchable database of keywords in the documents to share with defense attorneys. But prosecutors were also ordered not to examine the contents just yet. One of the matters federal agents are investigating is whether Cohen violated the law in his $130,000 payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels.
For years, Mr. Cohen has acted like he is above the law. That ends now.
Daniels, who appeared at the courthouse along with her attorney, alleges Cohen gave her the money shortly before the election to keep silent about an affair she had with Mr. Trump. Prosecutors say they could begin to make some of the documents seized in last week's raids available within days.
You know, the funny thing about Stormy is that she had no role in that court proceeding yesterday. She just showed up with her attorney to sit there. It's a classic New York circus trial atmosphere right now involving the president's personal attorney. It's got all the makings of a movie, no doubt about that. All right, so I'd rather hear what the young people think about this. And I don't even know what their political persuasions are. Do not judge them because they're from Brown. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are bleeding heart liberals. Inclined to be, but we don't guarantee that. Michael Hannity is an often guest here on the program, and here are 2 of his students. One from Boulder, Colorado, and one from New York, New York. Emma Chow and Alex Kramer. Emma, Alex. Political science. And what would you say? The real science? A real science? Neuroscience over
Exactly.
here, right? But both politically engaged. You're a volleyball player at Brown.
Yes, I am.
Awesome. You're a freshman recruit.
Yes.
And you're a freshman Manhattan kid coming up
Yes.
here to want to be near a state capital, correct?
Correct, and I'm lacking the athletic ability, Dan, but
You are?
hopefully I have other things that can carry me through.
All right, well, she can teach you how to spike a ball.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
I think
Yeah.
that might be more difficult than you think.
All right. Well, at least you're honest about that. All right. Do we need to set the scene on your political ideology, or should we just cut right into it? I think we'll probably get a little flavor as we go. What's your take on what's going on here, with Trump and his attorney and Stormy thing? Then we'll get into Comey. Then we'll get into the march. Then we'll get into some issues of youth and politics, and then we'll get into some partisanship issues, which I know that's part of your thing. What's your take on the story?
I mean, there's a lot going on for sure. A lot of crazy back and forth. I think it's definitely showing how divided we are as politics, even within our own parties. I think a good take on this is showing also how institutions are now playing a role in politics, whereas institutions prior may have tried to not show political face and get into that realm. It's seeming like everyone's getting dragged into
Institutions meaning what? FBI? That kind of
FBI
thing?
for sure, especially with Comey kind of having to be not political, but obviously with the election and dealing with Hillary Clinton and now with Trump and the Russian investigations and the firing has definitely brought a lot more awareness to how institutions play a role.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the Comey thing specifically in a little bit. What's your general take on what the atmosphere is?
Sure. So I think, Dan, that this really showcases just the general corruption of this administration. I think if you look at it, I'm not necessarily sure how this ties into the Comey scandal or any of the Russia collusion, but when you have a president whose personal attorney is paying out $130,000 in hush money, that just goes to show not only is it probably a violation of campaign finance laws, but you're not necessarily dealing with the straightest shooters on the block.
This might end up being a preach to the choir type of episode here. I'm not exactly sure. What's your general take on the flavor of the administration's efforts so far?
Politically?
Yeah. Other than the notion that they're corrupt.
Sure.
This notion that you think they're corrupt. Corrupt in terms of criminal behavior, corrupt in terms of their moral approach, corrupt how?
Well, I think probably I don't think I can comment on the criminal investigation going on into the president. Obviously, it's happening, and there's a lot going on probably behind the scenes that I don't know about. And I'm not sure they're morally corrupt either. However, I think they obviously have done some pretty sketchy things in the past, right? You don't pay off hush money. You don't meet with Russian oligarchs. You don't do a bunch of things that they've done if you're trying to win on the straight and narrow. But I think to your question of what they've done so far, or how I'm judging them politically, is that for the most part, it's been a pretty standard Republican administration in that what they've tried to do is pass tax cuts, which is a pretty common Republican talking point. They've repealed environmental regulation, which I think probably would have happened under any Republican president. And they tried to repeal and replace Obamacare, which obviously didn't happen. But I think sort of their policy goals are very much in line with what a general conservative administration would have done. I think when you move beyond their political goals into the scandal that seems to be surrounding the administration every day is where you really differentiate yourself.
I think the interesting part about that is when you lay those issues out, you have to determine who's really driving the bus. Is it Republicans in Congress, or is it Donald Trump morphing to that place, right? You're shaking your head.
Oh, for sure. I think there's a lot of role playing as far as Congress and Trump and their dynamic together, and who's really driving the boat is a very nice question. I think it's a little bit of both, but I think Trump, with being such a loud kind of voice on Twitter and in the social media and everything, he is taking up a lot of the stage. And
well,
definitely
you folks who live in the Twitter social media world, how do you receive the president's incessant tweeting?
Well,
Do you find it as unusual and uncomfortable as I do, and people I think who are older do?
So I definitely do. I have set up my Twitter alerts to get an alert every time the president tweets, which means often I wake up.
So your phone's pinging off the end table then, right?
Don't tell my mother, but I wake up and I have sort of a string of tweets from the president, and it can range from anything as serious as I think just the other day when we saw with Syria a tweet about our strikes there versus a tweet about the former FBI director, right? So it really sort of makes you wonder where he is mentally any given moment, right? If you're able to move so quickly from something with the severity of a missile strike in a foreign country to investigation into your administration, it really makes me question whether or not he's focused on the right things.
Tweeting freak you out at all?
Unlike Alex, I look at Twitter kind of not as frequently or get the alerts, but I kind of like scroll past them and I'm like, just kind of like sigh, just, oh my God, what is going on? Kind of like it's just crazy, just like constant firing of whatever Trump is dealing with at the moment.
Who tweets more, the president or you?
Oh, definitely the president.
Definitely the president. And I think before taking this class that we were both in together about politics and the sociology of democracy and dictatorship, I kind of looked at these tweets as kind of like a, oh, I can't believe it's happening again. But with my building of kind of like a political mind scheme and whatnot, I've definitely taken it more into account and looked at it a little deeper. And I think with kind of like the youth, some might be on my page, and I think it's like getting it more into the politics is what our youth needs to do in order to understand and to relate and kind of dive deeper into why is he saying what he's saying and what's important, what's not important.
So the platform is not as much of a concern as it is what he is saying. Is that what you're telling me, more or less?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, when we come back, we'll talk about some of this institutional concern and the partisan divide that exists out there. Stay with us.
Person who sees moral equivalence in Charlottesville, who talks about and treats women like they're pieces of meat, who lies constantly about matters big and small and insists the American people believe it, that person's not fit to be president of the United States on moral grounds.
All right, so that was a provocative statement that James Comey made and continues to make all week. Of course, we get into this, we've got some tweets back and forth here, headlines and tweets, right? So the president lashes out and suggests that perhaps James Comey ought to be jailed. I don't think the first time. Comey, fired back this morning and suggested that the president, again, is evidences that he's not morally fit to be the president, suggesting that private citizens ought to be jailed. Of course, James Comey is a unique type of private citizen, at least in the recent couple of months. But our freshman here from Political Science Thoughts at Brown, Emma, you're saying that institutional involvement in controversies now is a new thing.
Yeah. I think kind of maybe a little while ago, they were still having to deal with politics, but in such an age where there's a big voice of it in kind of like the social media aspect and in everyday life now, it's starting to show more. And I think that's like a big give and take because it's very different, especially when they're supposed to show face that they're not politically divided.
Does it bother you?
I think it doesn't.
You worried about the integrity of the FBI?
Yeah, I'm not as bothered by integrity, but I think it shows more about how everyone kind of is political and kind of like even in everyday speech, people are afraid to talk about politics and where they stand personally. And I think institutions have also kind of put of this like don't touch the politics kind of button. But I think with how politics are going and with how our country is moving, we need to be talking about politics and how it's impacting our everyday lives.
You buy this deep state thing?
I don't buy this deep state thing. I think it's a little bit ridiculous to insist that bureaucrats who work under different administrations and serve our country faithfully could possibly be a deep state. Obviously, there's a bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy, I have faith, carries on its mission regardless of who's in the White House. So if you want to consider that the deep state, then so be it. But I don't necessarily think it's out for bad political reason. I do want to touch on a point you asked Emma earlier. which is about sort of the politicalization or the politicization of the FBI. And, you know, I think when you're talking about James Comey, the one takeaway I really had from, you know, his interview on ABC was that he said he probably wouldn't have released his letter on Hillary Clinton if the election didn't seem to be in the bag for her, right? He thought she was going to be the president, and so he needed to release this letter to make sure that it seemed like he was doing his job. And I think that is a very, very clear indictment of the politics that infiltrated his office. And, you know, a lot of people, when Hillary Clinton published her book, said that she should step aside and sort of get out of the political spotlight. And it's, you know, interesting to me that no one is calling on Comey to do that. I get that it's a salacious book. I understand that people sort of want to know the ins and outs of
Nobody's
the
calling
Trump
on him to do what?
to not release his book and to sort of get out of the spotlight.
Well, I don't know. After 2 weeks, I think you're going to be sick and tired of him, to be honest with you.
I'm already sick and tired of him.
Right. So, but you also have a problem with the Trump administration on a pretty significant list. So you're probably looking at Comey as a credible player.
So I think James Comey...
The exposure, I think, is a high-risk exercise, right? It puts the FBI in a little bit of a uncomfortable, overexposed light. Perhaps it creates a little bit too much human drama around the institution, as you were suggesting. It'll be really interesting to see if he gets down in the gutter with the president, you know, every day here. It's not going to help.
I 100% agree with you, and I'm not sure that his, as I would describe it, sanctimonious tweeting is really doing him any favors as well. He knew that there were two investigations going on during the general election. There was one into our current president, and there was one into Secretary Clinton, and he chose to make one of them public and not the other for unabashedly political reasons.
Boy, I know we want to get to some other issues. I might have to drag Alex on the radio and have a longer forum on that, because I think the Clinton investigation had everything that, I mean, the pressure on the truth, you know, up to weeks in front of the election was immense. There was not much public recognition of the Russian investigation going on. That was just kicking up as the FBI was getting into it prior to the election. I think they're two very different things. And I think Comey makes a pretty good explanation of that. But when we come back, we'll talk about the young people in politics in general, the Parkland protests, and the divide we have politically. Stay with us. The young people have come out since, you know, one knucklehead did what he did at Douglas High School in Parkland. Of course, these two young people on set are only a year removed from high school. This must have shook you a little bit.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about the protests?
I think the protests are great. So I have been a part of the protests here. I've been a part of organizing on campus around this issue. I think it's fantastic that young people are finding their voice on this issue, that anyone is finding their voice on this issue. I think it's ridiculous that we're the only country in the world where things like this happen, and yet we take no action to prevent it from occurring again. And I think it's about time that we started listening to a generation who we've sort of thrown out as, you know, being millennials who are only focused on themselves or their avocado toast. I think it's great that people are beginning to sort of understand that we are politically engaged.
I don't know, maybe up until, and again, I don't want to make light of the shooting because it's one of our nation's worst tragedies, but up until that time you might have been just focused on your avocado toast, to be honest with you. I have lots of thoughts about your generation, and you're on the younger end of it. Are you actually millennials, or you're like something else, right?
I think we may have just missed the cutoff.
You're
just on the tail end.
Yeah, you're something else. I'm not exactly sure.
If you want to call it anything, I think you could call it the mass shooting generation. We've grown up going to high schools having to do lockdown drills. We've grown up having to experience this tragedy over and over. One of my clearest memories from middle school was when the Newtown shooting happened, and all of those kids in Sandy Hook were gunned down, and yet, you know, our government did nothing. So I think it's about time that our generation, having gone through this time after time, has stepped up.
I don't think there's any doubt that you're going to have to be taken very seriously, but is there a single solution to this?
I mean, I think there are just so many opinions and so many ideas, especially differing opinions from conservatives and liberals about infringement on rights and being able to still own a gun and not. And I think that's really our biggest issue right now is nobody's listening to the other side. I think it's great that people are getting out there, they're voicing their opinion, but how far can your own voice go if you're not listening to what people on the other side are saying? And I think that's what Trump has brought out in this era, is that we are not listening to the other side.
He's not exclusively responsible for it.
No, but I think just the way he presents himself and his ideas is very kind of like attacking a certain side per se. And I think this kind of mentality of us versus them is not helping us bridge the gap between, hey, how do I listen to you and how do you listen to me and how do we get to a solution?
There's no doubt that Donald Trump has chosen not to moderate this issue. He's chosen a side on this issue, and I guess that's what you're saying. And I think maybe from the executive branch, we're looking for a little bit of moderating leadership. I'm not talking about ideology. I'm talking about tone. And
Yeah.
I think it's probably what you're thinking about. But it's a very complicated solution.
Yeah.
We've had young people here in high school kids who talked about the need for a ton more guidance counselors as an investment in the schools, not just a discussion about AR-15s.
Of
right?
course. Of course, it's going to take an entire suite of reform to really make change, but it doesn't mean that making any change is impossible. So in Rhode Island this week, the House is going to be hearing the assault weapons ban and the Safe Schools Act, which would both do great things to make Rhode Island safer against mass shootings. But as you said, there are different steps that can be taken, whether that's in schools, adding more guidance counselors, or creating a universal background check system, which we don't have in this country.
What about the red flag legislation? I kind of like that.
So the red flag legislation is a little bit complicated, and there are definitely some concerns about it. I think I personally come out on the side of support. I think it's worked well in states like California. I think there can be an issue, of course, with your right to stand trial. I think there can be an issue with people suffering from mental health and discrimination against them. So I think maybe we need to think a little bit more deeply about some of the externalities that this law might have.
All right, well, I think that's some good thinking. How do we bridge this divide? You got 45 seconds to tell me how we're going to solve the whole problem.
Yeah, you know, 45 seconds is the perfect amount of time to talk about how to bridge that divide. But kind of like I was saying earlier, we need to reach out to the other side and be willing to listen to them. I think a lot of our divide comes from privilege and resentment of the other side, of this mysterious them compared to us. So I think just mixing, engaging with other people, reaching out on your own, and then pulling in friends from your own community and other communities is the first step.
So give me a short answer to a deep question. Were you this smart before you went to Brown, or is this all, or is this all been percolating since you got here?
I mean, Professor Hannity has definitely helped us out a lot, and I think Brown is a great place to continue.
Sounds to me you've got a little bit of a built-in frame of mind.
I may have been doing a little bit of this before Brown, but it doesn't mean it hasn't sort of expanded the scope of my personal inquiries, and I think it's a great place for anyone to do that.
Great job. Don't be strangers. Good luck for the rest of the semester. Freshmen at Brown. Final word when we come back. Stay with us. Freshmen, pretty impressive. I think the comment that got me most was the mass shooting generation. That one, I think we need to think about for a minute. What's going on with the hospital transactions tomorrow, and we'll see you on the radio at 3 on WPRO. Thanks for watching. Good night.